I grew up in San Francisco and went to middle school and high school there. In high school, at the age of 16, I met my wife, Rosie, my now wife, Rosie, and, and I was a junior and she was a senior. A year later, in '97, we had our son, Jorge, so we were really, really young parents. When she became pregnant, I didn't know how to react or didn't know how to be the person who I had to be for her. So I started kind of just going my own direction and kind of left her abandoned, pretty selfish, and we broke up for a good while, and I just didn't know how to cope with being a dad and everything. So I kind of ran from it, started hanging out with the wrong crowd, and so we were broken up for a while. And even after my son was born, I was still kind of a absent father. I was running around town doing my own thing, all about me. But during that whole time, I would kind of come to my senses and come back home and try to have a relationship with her, because I did love my son a lot, and he was kind of the glue that kept us together for many years. And so I would come home, but also I had a lot of friends who were constantly calling me. It would start off with basketball, baseball, football, and then it would go on to going out and staying out, just doing nothing but hanging out with all the fellas. So then we started to meet with other groups, other people we were playing basketball with, other kind of a gangster crowd. So we started hanging around with the gangster crowd a little bit, and then they introduced us to heavy alcohol, they introduced us to weed. So we were I was out more, I was absent more, I was doing drugs and alcohol started to really, really care less and less about my wife and my son. So then we eventually moved into an apartment together, and we had a good amount of bills, so I figured I had to get a second job. So I got a job at UPS in South San Francisco. We were living in San Francisco. So at UPS, that's when things got bad. I met some worse guys who were actually dealing with crank and cocaine, and I started selling some cocaine with some of the guys over at UPS. And being that I had a full-time job during the day, very high-stress job, I would go to UPS exhausted mentally, but then I was able to do the job physically because my mind was fine. But then right before starting work, we started to drink, and we started to do some cocaine and do a few lines, and then get to work, unpackage boxes faster than any other person. And so it was just kind of a rush. And after work, it would get worse and worse, because we'd spend time at the parking lot smoking weed, smoking crack, snorting coke, and just got worse and worse. And all the while, my wife would wait at home and just kind of wouldn't have an idea where I was. Eventually it got worse and worse. I started to not come home at all. I started not showing up at home, and she would just worry a lot, and she would get Georgie, our son, and just take him with and drive out to the UPS parking lot in South San Francisco in the middle of the night. She would drive by hospitals and trying to figure out where I was, if I was anywhere, and if I was hurt. And so this was the life that we were living. I was completely into the drugs and the party scene, and she was a devoted mother. Well,
how long was this going on for?
So far it's like 2 years.
2 years?
Yeah, just starting. So as she continued to suffer, my family, who was very devoted to Christ, started to notice something about her, and started to come over the house and just hold Bible studies at our little kind of apartment there. And so they would have Bible studies and just show up on Tuesday nights while I was at UPS, and they would stay till about 10, 11, like Christians do, just stay there talking and eating and drinking coffee. And all the while they'll kind of ask, where's George? Shouldn't be home by now. And so I wouldn't be home until the next day, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. And so they really started to have compassion for my wife and my son. And so they just made it a consistent thing to show up there on Tuesday nights And on one of those Tuesday nights, my wife, in the middle of prayer and her crying and suffering, she was asked if she wanted to receive the Lord as Savior in her life. And she said, yes, I need something. I can't do this anymore. And so after she accepted Christ, this was probably about 2 years into the addiction and the partying of me being absent and all that. So after that, it was another, at least after she got saved, 6 to 7 years. And so she was just, when she got saved, she thought that, that things were going to be awesome and that life was going to change and that God was going to turn things around, but the opposite happened. I became more detached to my family and attached to my friends, and then I was smoking way more crack with weed, and I was drinking like crazy. I would constantly be, with a bottle of alcohol and a bag of Coke everywhere I went. And I started missing 2 days and 3 days and 4 days and 11 days sometimes. And she was just absolutely suffering. And so life was impossible for her. And for me, it was just full of shame and full of guilt, because I would come to myself. Like, for example, I remember being at a crack house in the middle of Hunters Point with a bunch of crackheads that I've been kind of hanging with the whole night. And I remember leaving that house after about 12 hours of straight drugs and alcohol. And I remember getting out the house and just looking up at the sky as if I knew God, and just saying, God, what am I doing? I got my beautiful son. I got my wife at home, my beautiful wife. Why am I doing this? I would have glimpses of how bad I was, and I would go to him. I just had this feeling like he was hearing me or watching me. And I would just ask him, why am I so terrible? Why am I so bad? And those kind of glimpses would get a little more serious sometimes. I remember so many times being on a Bay Bridge coming from San Francisco. We were now living in El Sobrante, and I would just simply wake up in my driveway. I would leave where I was in the city or in San Bruno or whatever, and I would just arrive, just show up in my carport, and it was just because I was so drunk and wasted. I would black out, but somehow make it home every single time. Well, one of those times I was just not blacked out, so I was on the Bay Bridge, and I know that I had been a horrible dad, a terrible husband, and I just wanted to end my life, so I slowed down because I wanted to jump off the bridge. But then I guess I was a coward. I was too scared to do that, so I just kind of slowed down. I thought about it real hard and just kept on going. I just didn't have the guts for it, but I was miserable. I was sick of the shame. I was embarrassed of my life. I was sick of hurting my family. My daughter was now born. And so I was just this addicted, pretty selfish monster that only thought about himself. And so when we moved out to El Sobrante, the lifestyle continued. I would be home on Thursday, and then Friday not come home until the following Monday. And this went on for a long time. And I remember coming home like on a Sunday night or early Monday and getting home, and I would just hear and see my wife in the back porch there screaming at God and crying to God and asking God, why is it that I'm such a bad person? Why is it that she suffers so much? If she loves him, why is it that her life won't change? And why is it that he's not doing something about it? And she was at the very end. She was already talking about separation, and she would leave. She would often leave the house with the kids. She would get all our garbage bags, our black bags. Like my parents would say, ya viene con la bolsa negra. I mean, she's coming with the garbage bags again. And so it was a pretty sad routine, but I would come home sometimes and the closets would be empty, the blankets would be gone and pillows would be gone, and I knew that I had to go find her somewhere. At that point, I would find her at, her friends or her moms or her sisters, and then I would just beg her to come back. I would cry. I would tell her that I was going to come to church with her. Just this huge kind of hypocrisy and lies just to get her back home. So eventually I would get her back home, and eventually I would do okay for about a week or two, but I had like zero willpower. I still had all the friends calling me. I still worked at UPS. I still I loved the drugs, and it was just, they were just yanking at me. I felt like at some point it stopped being a choice. So in the middle of that, God was doing, in the middle of all that, in the middle of just the terrible life, he was still involved in my life. There were, I could recall three major accidents where I should have been dead, 100% dead. I totaled 4 cars. I had the engine right in front of my chest from my own car. I didn't have a seatbelt on, and I looked around and just walked away and actually ran away. And that was one of the times where God was just like, it's not your time, even though you should be dead right now. This accident should have killed you. You're still alive, and I'm going to give you a shot. And on top of that, the CHP looked at me after they went to my house, and they're going to arrest me. And they said, you got a beautiful wife, you got beautiful kids, you got to change your life. You got to turn around. There was another time where I was again really drunk driving, and I was going down this lane real fast, racing a friend, being stupid, and another car came, and I was on the wrong side of the lane, and I just went off to the left into the kind of the sidewalk area and ran into a couple signs, a stop sign and another sign. With the stop sign, I impacted it so hard that it turned into kind of a C, and the blade of the stop sign itself cut my head open, and the cops came, and it was just this horrific, gruesome scene, and the cops just looked at me, looked at my car, and got all my information and said, it's punishment enough, you can go home. So they sent me home with the tow truck. Worst feeling in the world was coming home with the tow truck and a car totaled that we hadn't even paid for yet. And so when I get home, I didn't want to talk. I was just full of shame and just feeling stupid and embarrassed. I sit back and Rosie looks, and I had all this blood coming down the back of my shirt and all over the couches. So we immediately ran to the emergency room. When I got to the emergency room, they started to clean all the glass out of my skull, and as they're doing that, they're numbing me and everything. And Rosie was there with the kids, and the nurse looks at me, and she looks at Rosie, and she looks at me, and she says, "You've got to change your life. You got to change your ways." And so she goes ahead and she staples me all up, and so again, I made it alive. I should have been dead, but God had some plan for me that I had no idea of. So that kind of straightened me out for about a day or two, and a few days later, I was back out, just completely selfish and only caring about my desires, my drugs, and my time with my friends, and just completely deadbeat dad, no love for nothing but myself. And so throughout all these years, one of the things that my wife and I did was we kept a tradition. And so we would go to family camp every single year on Labor Day weekend, the first weekend of September. And so this was 2004, and we were going to do it again. We only had one vehicle, so I dropped her off at work, I dropped the kids off, and I went to work myself. And so when I went to work, I went out to lunch with a friend, another project manager, and we started just talking and drinking beers and more beers, and started taking shots. And after a few hours of that, it was kind of time for some cocaine. So we went to the drug guy, got some dope, and started doing cocaine. And at that point, everything that I cared about was gone. I didn't pick up my wife that day. I didn't pick up my kids. I abandoned them like I would always. And so she had to get a cab, and she had to go get the kids, and then have a cab go all the way to El Sobrani. They were in San Francisco. And so, and that whole night, all I did was party. Didn't care about missing the retreat or anything. So the next day, I show up at the house at about 6 a.m., and she was gone. It was a familiar scene, so I called up her mom as usual. And I asked her, "Is Rosie with you?" And she goes, "What? What do you mean? She left to the camp." So I called Rosie, and I said, "Are you okay?" And she goes, "Yeah, my sister brought me to the camp all the way up to Santa Cruz." And I just said, "Wow, okay." So she said, "Just get up here and be safe." And it was just the amazing peace that I heard in her voice. And I was just so used to the fighting and the hatred, rightfully so, coming my way because I was constantly, destroying her life, And so I go up there, and as soon as I show up there, it was just, again, this peace about her. She just had this peace, and I couldn't understand it because I was so used to the opposite of that because of what I had done. And so we go through the day, and now I'm kind of up for about 24 hours, 30 hours, 32 hours. So we make it all the way to night, and there's this church service, and I was way in the back. I wasn't into the service at all, but I still had kind of the alcohol and the drug in my system, so it was I was not there so much. And so that service went on for about 3 hours. It was a Latin service, so they know how to go long. So then after that, she says, okay. So I said, all right, time to go. She says, no, we have to stay for the youth service too. I said, no way. So we stayed for the youth service, and that went for about 2 hours. And this was just like crazy because I was in the back. I was just dying. I was kind of asleep, kind of not there, kind of zombie. And so they finally get through the 2 hours, and at the end of the sermon, they have time of worship and altar call. So my wife was always the first one to run to the altar and just start crying to God and asking God to do something special, to perform a miracle in her life. And so as always, she was at the altar, and she was telling God that she'd already contacted an attorney, that they're going to move forward with a divorce, and she can't do it no more. But at the same time, she was still believing God and being hopeful, telling God that I know that you can do something. So she was bare before God, and God heard her cry. And so in the middle of her mascara being all over the place, in the middle of her not caring what anyone thought anymore, she just asked God to do something. She promised God that she would love him forever if he would just do something miraculous in her life. And so she's crying and she's pleading and she's putting all her baggage in a bag and giving it to God. And so at that moment, God spoke to her and said, "It is done. It is done." Well, I'm way in the back, and I don't care anything about an altar call. I don't care anything about a worship service that's going on. And I'm half dead. I've been partying for a while, and I was in a bad place. And all of a sudden, I start to feel this blanket kind of thing come down on me, this warm blanket. And it felt like little prickly needles, and it just felt like something was covering me, and something was kind of embracing me, and it was kind of warm, and I could feel the sharpness of it. And all of a sudden, I don't know why, but I was crying uncontrollably, and I was just bawling, and I had no idea. I wasn't praying. I wasn't doing anything. All I could do was cry and cry. And I remember right at that moment that one of my cousins was up on stage leading worship, and she was singing this song, "Open the floodgates of heaven and let it rain." And that's how it felt. It felt like it was raining on me. And I just felt something just coming down on me. And that was God. He was actually just answering my wife's cry and answering her call. And I was nothing more than the recipient of a faithful woman finally getting blessed. So from that night, September 4, 2004, I have not been the same. The Lord touched me miraculously. He changed my life. Absolute radical transformation that was immediate. And the beautiful part about it is that I'll never be able to take credit for it. He saved me because of this faithful soldier called Rosie. She believed God until she couldn't believe anymore. And he didn't give her more than she could handle. And he heard her cry and answered her and saved my soul immediately and radically on September 4th, 2004.